So we're having some technical difficulties, so I'm talking about governance. I'll give you an interpretive dance of the main points of my slide. That'll give the translator something to work with. So let me just get going here. When we talk about governance, first of all, I'm going to focus on groundwater management and the lessons we can learn from 50 years of groundwater management in the United States. So I'll talk some about Nebraska and some about the rest of the western part of the United States, where there are many different experiences. First of all, it's important to acknowledge that groundwater underpins water security and economic development in both rural and urban areas. So it's important in areas that depend solely on groundwater, but it's also important in areas where there is significant surface water with seasonality. The second thing I need to say is that managing groundwater is much more difficult than managing surface water. And that is for reasons that will become clear as my presentation goes forward. But there are a number of experiences of countries or regions that have long-time experience of managing surface water that struggle to manage their groundwater resources. The next thing is that when we look at groundwater, the experience of the issues around groundwater are quite common worldwide, but local context is incredibly important. So this is one thing that when you look at governance, the local context is incredibly important. And so the main issue then is how we get from learning what works somewhere and translating it to another region. So over the last day and a bit, we've heard a lot about the Nebraska model of groundwater governance and how we can move that or use that in Argentina. I'd argue that that isn't really the right issue because the culture in Argentina is different, the history is different, the institutions that exist here, the legal frameworks are also different. So the main question is, what can you learn from the experience in Nebraska as to why groundwater governance works there that can be taken and adapted to the local context that you have in Argentina? I think that's really the important question. Again, the underlying hydrological issues are very similar, but the local context really matters. All right, so I think we're about to, I'll keep fingers crossed. The next slide is a picture of key issues, policy drivers for groundwater management. So that's the English version, though. Sorry. So when we look at the key issues of groundwater, so this is a good test for me as to how well I can do with no cues whatsoever. So when we look at the drivers of groundwater management, sure, I guess while we did this one. So three things really drive groundwater management globally. There are three kinds of problems that we see. The first is surface water groundwater interaction. So when you pump groundwater and it's connected hydrologically to waters at the surface, you have impacts on the surface. This is something that over the last 20 years or so has driven the majority of conflict and the majority of policy for groundwater management. It's something that I think people might not realize the extent to which surface water groundwater interaction is a policy driver. There are two ways in which this happens. One is impacts on freshwater ecosystems, whether those are wetlands or endangered species. The second is that surface water typically already belongs to someone, and that may be somebody further downstream. And so to the extent that groundwater pumping affects surface water, there may be legal implications from groundwater pumping. Second of all, long-term aquifer depletion. This is the thing that's in the news all the time when you look at what's happening in California, when you look at what's happening in India, in China, and so on. It's obviously a very long-term issue that is critical to the sustainability of agricultural production worldwide. However, from a policy perspective, we've generally been not very successful at managing groundwater depletion. So areas where there is long-term groundwater depletion tend to continue to have long-term groundwater depletion. However, there are a growing number of policies to try to address this. I'm optimistic that some of these will be successful in the coming years. And then thirdly, water quality issues are becoming more and more important in terms of drivers for groundwater management. So in particular, there are a number of examples, but the one that tends to be most important is impacts on drinking water supply. Ah, here we go. Here's the version that you understand, but I don't. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Drinking water issues related to agricultural production or related to the impacts of long-term depletion, such as when you have mobilization of arsenic or uranium, are getting more and more important, and dealing with those water quality issues from a policy perspective is also very, very important. So the Water for Food Global Institute and the University of Nebraska were involved in a number of worldwide partnerships that form the basis for what I'm going to talk about today. One is a partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, where we have a report that we've worked on that will be released in the next month or so, looking at different groundwater management practices around the Western US and trying to figure out what has worked in different areas to deal with different problems and why. So one of the case studies is actually the Upper Republican Natural Resources District, and Jasper and his staff were very helpful in helping us out with that one. But there are examples from California, Arizona, Washington State, and elsewhere in the US. The other initiative we're involved with is an international initiative, the Groundwater Solutions Initiative for Policy and Practice, which is headed by the International Water Management Institute. And that's intended as a learning community, again, for understanding and translating best management practices. So what have we found? So this basically is the Environmental Defense Fund collaboration. There's really, when you look at where groundwater management mostly works, you find that there are 5 characteristics you need to consider. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. First of all, you have to build trust. Trust is a word that occurred a little bit yesterday, but when you talk about governance and groundwater governance, trust is the most important thing. The community that is being managed must trust that the institutions are working in their favor, must be vested in those institutions. And that generally means you need a local governance approach. The second finding is you need to have the right data, the right information to manage the system. That includes both baseline data and then ongoing monitoring data. What exactly those data are depends on the problem you're trying to manage for. And it's important to acknowledge, as I'll come to further down the list, collecting data is expensive. Right? Collecting data is expensive both in terms of the equipment and in terms of the human cost of managing that and understanding it. So depending on the problem that you have, you may or may not need to have the Rolls-Royce monitoring. You can sometimes get by with less. Third of all, it's important to understand that groundwater management is a portfolio of tools and policies. I don't know if any of you have ever read the rules and regulations for one of the natural resources district in Nebraska. I know that Jasper has. He's been instrumental in writing them. They're dozens of pages long, and a typical groundwater management district has dozens or even more regulations. Some of them are very simple, some of them are very complicated. Some of them have been around for decades, some of them are brand new, some of them are tried and then discarded because they don't work. So there's a portfolio of approaches to management that you build up over time, and the approach is very much an adaptive management one. So you can't go into a very, very sophisticated system without a lot of work to get it there. The fourth is assuring performance. So any policy is only as good as its monitoring and enforcement. It's quite easy to write a policy. It's just ink on paper. It's very much harder to enforce that policy. And the mark of good groundwater governance, or one key mark of good groundwater governance, is what happens when things go wrong, what happens when people don't stick to their policies. How do you deal with that, and how do you maintain the trust of the community? So Jasper actually gave one example of that yesterday in the Upper Republican Natural Resources District. It's an example that I try to use a lot in my presentations because in this case you had a very strong enforcement mechanism where You had a individual producer in the area who bypassed their flow meters to get around a regulation on water metering. They were found, I guess this was a repeated offender, and they lost their water right, which at that point is a multi-million-dollar equivalent fine. And then last but not least, and I'll say that's very unusual, that level of strong groundwater governance. We're very fortunate to find that in Nebraska, but typically when you look at groundwater management institutions, you find policies that are strongly written but poorly enforced. That's very much the norm. And then last but not least, you have to have funding. Right? Somebody has to pay for all of the management, and we'll come to that next. So I want to talk a little bit about what this all means and give the case study of Nebraska. This is a picture of the High Plains Aquifer. I think Jesse did a fabulous job of describing that. So Nebraska here is this state. It has most of the water stored in the High Plains Aquifer. Some of you have seen this from the air. So this is also a picture I like to show. This is southwestern Nebraska. So each one of these center pivots is a little bit over 50 hectares. And so I like, when I talk about governance, I like to show this picture. I'd like you all to take a minute and tell me in this picture, so this is probably a little bit more than $100 million of value of irrigation infrastructure. How much of that irrigation infrastructure is public investment and how much is private investment? All right, so let's start with the actual irrigation infrastructure. How much of that is public? Zero. Okay, it's all private investment. Now, that said, that doesn't mean there is no public investment here. Where's the public investment? You have the road network, you have the energy network, you have the monitoring for the data that lets you put it in there, and more importantly, you have the governance system. Right? Now, you can't tell whether the governance system is working here or not. Actually, I would argue that you can tell because most of those pivots have very healthy crops under them. And if you look in other parts of the world, if you look in parts of southwest Kansas or northern Texas, you sometimes have this density of pivots, but almost none of the pivots can support a full crop. So there are both visible and invisible parts of the investment here, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind. But this is one of the reasons, to my mind, why groundwater is much harder to manage than surface water. In a typical canal or dam system, the infrastructure is publicly held and easy to manage. You can turn off a turnout, you can turn off a gate. In a system where all of the resources of production are privately held, monitoring becomes much more difficult. So, what are some of the issues in Nebraska? We have a lot of groundwater in Nebraska. As a result, we have most of the groundwater issues that you find somewhere in the state. We don't have issues with subsidence, and we don't have issues with seawater intrusion, but just about everything else we find somewhere in the state. So there are pockets of the state where there is long-term depletion. We have a number of long-lived transboundary disputes over surface water allocation. We have issues with maintaining stream flow for wildlife. We need to protect water quality for drinking water. And then on top of that, there's also flooding and droughts to deal with. So these are all issues when you look at Nebraska water that have to be dealt with. As we heard yesterday, Nebraska practices or has a local system of groundwater governance where we have 23 natural resources districts. These are roughly based around watersheds, not fully, but roughly. They were formed in 1972, so they're 45 years old. The important part about the natural resources districts is they are units of local government, but they have boards of directors that are elected and that must live in the region of the NRD. So they have elected boards of directors, and under those boards of directors serve professional staff, technical staff, and programs. Another thing that's important, and again, this was emphasized yesterday, but I want to come back to it, the natural resources districts are responsible for a number of things beyond just managing groundwater. So they are responsible also for soil conservation, for flood control, for recreation, and they have large education programs. And I'd argue that this is one of the ways in which the natural resources districts actually build trust in the local communities. So not every role they have is regulatory in nature. There are other roles that they work closely with the schools on education programs. They work closely to help their producers access federal money for soil conservation, for cost share for other technologies, and so on. So they have many roles beyond just telling people what they can't do with their groundwater. So what are the 4 things that I would say that the natural resources districts are doing that work very well? And I've kind of said all of these before, but I'll come back to them again because I think they're so important. First of all, it's local governance. So you have locally elected boards of directors that are voted in, then with a good technical staff underneath them to execute programs, to build and develop programs. The second point is very important, and those words are picked and hopefully translated carefully. The NRDs have both the ability and the willingness to make and enforce rules. In many areas, when you look at irrigation district rules, you often don't have the legal ability to make the rules that you need to sustain the resource. So it's important that your management district actually has the legal authority to do what it needs to do. And then it needs to be willing to do it. And sometimes those decisions, and again, if you talk to any of the NRD managers, they often take decisions that make people unhappy. You can go to the board meetings and people are often agitated. But it's necessary to be able to do that and to be able to explain those decisions. So you have to have both the legal authority and the willingness to put in the rules and then to enforce the rules. And again, that's something that we don't see looking across the world at most of the irrigation districts that you see don't have that. As I said, managing groundwater doesn't come cheap. When you look at the 23 natural resources districts, their annual budget is around $250 million. So that's $250 million collected from a population of about 2 or less than 2 million. And again, that's not just groundwater management. They have many other programs, but that is a significant investment in resource sustainability. The NRDs, they raise money through taxes. They have real estate taxes. They have an occupation tax on irrigated land. They can apply for state and federal grants. And they also have the ability to go into bond markets as a local government agency. Am I missing any there, Jasper? That's basically it. And then this last one, there needs to be some oversight. So I have emphasized, and I'm a strong believer in local governance. However, there is some oversight from the state level. So in this case, the natural resources districts do have some oversight from the State Department of Natural Resources, which is ultimately responsible for the state's waters. And so for some of the kinds of changes in management plan, there is essentially a negotiation between the NRDs and the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. I think depending on who you ask, there's not enough supervision or too much supervision, but there is at least some oversight at a higher level. So to come back to my 5 conclusions, when we look specifically in Nebraska, how do you build trust around your groundwater management institutions? Well, first, they're 45 years old. The boards of directors are elected in answer to the voters in the district. Those districts typically did not jump straight into very complicated policies, but they took their time to understand the system and make changes and educate the public around those changes. That requires collecting data, and it requires collecting data in a way that people understand what you're doing with it. There's a portfolio of tools that the districts use. Again, some of their tools are quite straightforward and very standardized, and sometimes even use paper and pen reporting. Some of the tools that they use are financially sophisticated instruments or infrastructure that has a multi-decade lifespan, and there's everything in between. Assurance of performance, again, monitoring and enforcement are vital. One of the huge advantages of the NRDs that I think help it to, or help the system to survive and build a longer-term trust, is that they are able to enforce policies that are unpopular, and also to put in policies that are, at the time, occasionally unpopular. And then again, they have access to funding. So not just through one mechanism, but there are multiple funding mechanisms there that the districts can use. And of course, as public agencies, there is transparency there in how those funds are spent. So with that said, thank you very much for your time.